15 years ago, if you had walked into our so-called office, you probably would have laughed. It wasn't much more than a broom closet perched above a payday loan place, the kind of building where the neon sign outside buzzed louder than our old space heater. We didn't even have chairs that matched. One was a cracked plastic lawn chair, another was stolen from a middle school gym auction. The air conditioner whined like a dying goat every time someone microwaved instant noodles, and the carpet smelled like ambition soaked into mildew. That was the empire I started in. 4 people crammed shoulder to shoulder, running on caffeine, adrenaline, and blind faith. No investors, no glossy pitch decks, no safety net. Just a whiteboard so stained you could never erase it completely, and a dream I couldn't get out of my head. Everyone else had recycled ideas, reheated versions of someone else's next big thing. But I had blueprints, real ones, designs that weren't flashy, weren't sexy, but worked, and that made all the difference. I still remember scavenging parts off eBay because that was all I could afford. A motor here, a busted circuit board there. My soldering iron shocked me so many times I thought I was developing a permanent twitch, but I didn't care. I kept going. Night after night, hunched over a folding table, sweat dripping onto wires, caffeine shaking my hands. Then one night it came alive. That ugly little box, nothing more than wires, duct tape, and stubbornness, hummed exactly the way it was supposed to. My first prototype. The sound wasn't pretty, but it was mine. The others stared, half disbelieving, half excited, as the damn thing did exactly what the blueprints promised. That moment lit something in me I can't describe. The smell of burning circuits, the flicker of a dying light bulb overhead, the exhaustion in my bones, it all melted into one truth. I could build something from nothing. That prototype became patent 1. Then came 2, 3, and by year 5 I had 16 patents to my name. 16 inventions born out of that broom closet. The company grew around them like ivy climbing a wall. Deals trickled in at first. A small automation firm, a mid-tier pharma lab. Then bigger names, hungrier ones. Corporations with deep pockets and endless appetites. My ugly little box had turned into the backbone of something real. But in those early days, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't about titles or shares. I didn't care about company retreats or stock options or whatever Silicon Valley buzzword was trending. I just wanted a lab, a budget, and enough time to chase the next idea. And I got it. Not easily, not without fights and failures, but every patent was proof that the risk had been worth it. I didn't look like a CEO. I didn't talk like a visionary. I wore the same pair of jeans 3 days in a row and sometimes forgot to shower. But when I walked into that closet office, I felt 10 feet tall. Because no matter how small the space, no matter how cheap the coffee, no matter how bleak the odds, we were making something that mattered. And in America in that moment, that was enough to keep me alive. Looking back, I should have seen the warning signs, the whispers of what would eventually come. Success has a way of attracting more than opportunity. It attracts parasites too. But back then, in the haze of solder smoke and takeout containers, I wasn't thinking about enemies. I wasn't thinking about betrayal. I was proud. Proud that something I built with my own burned fingers and sleepless nights was turning into a company that employed people, fed families, and caught the attention of industries that had never even heard of us. In that broom closet, I wasn't just an engineer. I was the engine. And engines don't stop. They run until something or someone decides to cut the power. 5 years. That's how long it took to go from a busted folding table and scavenged parts to an office with 3 full floors downtown, the kind where the windows stretched floor to ceiling and made you feel like you owned the skyline. By then my name was attached to 16 patents, each one a small miracle born out of sleepless nights and bloodied fingers. They called me lead inventor, though it was more honorary than practical. No office with my nameplate, no assistants or entourage, just a plaque on the wall and the freedom to keep doing what I loved. Building. And build I did. Patent 19 reduced production costs by nearly 20% for one of our biggest clients. Patent 27 improved safety compliance so effectively that even OSHA sent us a thank you letter. And then came the crown jewel. Patent 34, an adaptive process flow that let manufacturers switch production lines on the fly without shutting down operations. That one invention alone brought in $280 million in new contracts. The press called it revolutionary. I called it Tuesday. The funny thing is, I never cared about the spotlight. Interviews, I turned them down. Keynote speeches, I passed them to the suits. My world was the lab. I didn't wear tailored suits or memorize talking points. I wore safety goggles, oil-stained jeans, and a grin whenever a prototype finally came alive. To me, that was the real glory. Meanwhile, the company transformed around me. The break room stocked sparkling water instead of tap. Espresso machines imported from Italy hummed louder than the servers, and HR rolled out policies thicker than the Constitution. The same people who once shared instant noodles with me now debated vacation packages in Maui. Growth changes people, it changes everything. But through it all, I stayed the same. Heads down, hands busy. The backbone they didn't advertise but couldn't operate without. Even the CFO, a numbers-first kind of guy, always made sure I was looped into compliance reviews. Legal kept my clauses ironclad because they knew, without innovation, a company is just burning investor cash until the truth shows up. And I was the fire starter. Contracts grew bigger. Defense companies, manufacturing giants, Silicon Valley titans, each came knocking, pretending they weren't desperate for what I had created, sending their interns to my demos like spies with clipboards. And each time I delivered. On time. Bulletproof, watertight. For years, I never missed a filing deadline. Not once. I didn't take shortcuts, didn't bend the rules. My inventions weren't just clever, they were fortified. Every patent had layers of legal armor, every prototype was forward compatible. The tech worked, the contracts held, and the company thrived. Sometimes I caught my reflection in those new glass walls and almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I'd changed, but because everything else had. The broom closet was long gone. The smell of burnt coffee replaced with artisanal brews. The four of us who once huddled around a single space heater had turned into thousands of employees spread across multiple states. And yet, even standing in the middle of that empire, I didn't feel like a king. I wasn't interested in power plays or boardroom politics. I never asked for stock options. I never wanted to sit on stage under hot lights while investors clapped for numbers I barely cared about. All I wanted was a workbench, a budget, and a problem worth solving. I gave them solutions that fueled their empire. In return, they gave me freedom, at least for a while, and maybe that was my mistake. Because the bigger the empire grew, the easier it became for people to forget who had built the engine that kept it running. And the thing about engines, people rarely notice them until something goes wrong. Success doesn't just attract admirers, it attracts opportunists. And I should have known the moment Victor walked into the building that the storm had finally arrived. He didn't look like an engineer, didn't sound like one either. His shoes were polished so sharp they reflected the ceiling lights, his tie knotted with the precision of a YouTube tutorial, and his handshake rehearsed to the point of parody. He introduced himself with a smile that felt like grease, slippery, artificial, leaving you with the need to wipe your hand afterward. "Call me Victor," he said, like we were about to become best friends. Like 15 years of sweat, patents, and burnt fingertips could be erased by a first-name policy. Victor wasn't a builder. He was an acquisition hire dragged in by the parent company after they bought us out. His official title, Chief Innovation Strategist. What did that mean? It meant he didn't know how to solder a wire, but he knew how to sell buzzwords. Scalability, synergy, disruption, the man spoke in cliches like they were scripture. His resume was stacked with bankrupt companies, each collapse described as successful exits. He was the kind of guy who would trademark the phrase idea ecosystem and call it a deliverable. At first, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he'd bring fresh ideas, maybe he'd actually help. So when he toured the lab his first week, I walked him through our prototypes. Showed him how the torque stabilizer worked, how we were optimizing adaptive flow systems. He nodded like a bobblehead, eyes glazed, then asked, "Can we make this more viral?" I laughed, thinking it was a joke. He didn't laugh back. That's when I realized he was dead serious. Week 2, the changes began. Small at first. Meetings I had always attended suddenly disappeared from my calendar. Not essential this time, they said. We'll loop you in later. Later never came. Then came the budgets. My lab funds were cut in half with a single spreadsheet update reallocated to marketing initiatives. No warning, no explanation. I confronted my manager. Well, my former manager, since apparently the new org chart had reassigned me to special projects advisor. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. It came from Victor, she mumbled, stirring her coffee like the answers were hiding in the foam. By the end of the month, 2 of my best engineers were gone, reassigned to Victor's shiny new innovation pod. Nobody told me. I walked into the lab one morning and their desks were empty, name tags scrubbed off the Kanban board like they had never existed. The silence hit harder than the budget cuts. It was the silence of being erased, one meeting, one engineer, one decision at a time. That's when I started keeping notes. Every cut, every skipped meeting, every time my work was redirected without my sign-off. I wasn't angry, not yet. More like the stillness before a thunderstorm, when the air feels heavy and you can smell the rain coming. But the real gut punch came at the quarterly review. I had spent weeks preparing a detailed report on Patent 35, a process enhancement that could reduce downtime by 11%. My slides were meticulous, data, prototypes, risk assessments, the works. But when the projector clicked on, it wasn't my slides up there. It was Victor's. Stock photos of smiling workers, vague bullet points like next phase optimization, and front and center Victor's face on the title slide as if he'd dreamed it up during a weekend yoga retreat. My name wasn't mentioned once, not even in fine print. I sat in the back row, coffee cup trembling in my hand, knuckles white. The board nodded along, oblivious. They didn't care who built the engine. All they cared about was that the car kept moving, and Victor knew how to make it look shiny while coasting on other people's fuel. The worst part wasn't that he stole credit, it was how easily the room believed him. As the applause trickled in, I felt something inside me shift. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was calculation. A decision, because while Victor thought he was cutting me out, he had no idea that I had been preparing for this possibility years ago. He thought he was winning, he thought he was erasing me, but I was already sharpening the blade he wouldn't see coming. There isn't a single moment when a builder gets erased. It doesn't happen with a gunshot. It happens with paper, with calendar invites you never receive, with budgets you can't find, with keycards that suddenly stop opening the good doors. Week 3, the little nick started to bleed. A quick sync appeared on the company-wide calendar roadmap alignment. My name wasn't on it. I pinged ops. Not essential this time. The phrase had a way of multiplying. Suddenly, I wasn't essential to strategy, then to hiring, then to vendor calls, then to the demo I had personally engineered. The lab request queue once routed through me was replumbed to Victor's new innovation pod, a glass-walled aquarium filled with post-its that said things like delight, viral, and brand energy. They ran design sprints on problems I had already solved 2 years ago. When I finally saw next quarter's budget, it read like a eulogy. Lab consumables, halved, test rig maintenance, deferred, compliance allocation, temporarily reallocated to market storytelling. The number that funded metal, diodes, and safety interlocks now paid for a go-to-market anthem video. I took the printout to my manager's office, oak desk, soft lamp, the kind of quiet that makes bad news sound gentle. She winced before I spoke. It came from above, she said, voice low, eyes on the photo of her kids. Just for a quarter. But quarters stack. You learn that building machines, tolerances drift, calibration slips, a millimeter becomes a centimeter and then a broken arm. Companies break the same way, only with nicer stationery. 2 engineers vanished from my Kanban overnight. Their Jira assignments reappeared under Innovation Pod, reframed, reimagined. I found their badges on my workbench like abandoned dog tags. When I asked security where they'd been reassigned, the guard shrugged at her monitor. New org chart, she said. I just follow the colors. So I started writing things down. A notebook, cloth-bound, nothing digital that could be disappeared with a permissions change. Dates, times, names, subject lines, screenshots printed and stapled. A log of every skipped safety check, every spec altered without sign-off, every quick win that introduced a long-tail risk. It wasn't anger yet, it was instrumentation. When a system begins to vibrate out of true, you measure before you tighten. Then came the quarterly review. I'd submitted a deck for process #35, an 11% downtime reduction validated across 3 manufacturing partners. The night before, legal asked me to trim technical granularity for story clarity. I trimmed, reluctantly. The morning of, Victor opened with a smile bright enough to sterilize an operating room. The deck on screen wasn't mine. My charts were replaced with stock photography and verbs that floated 6 inches off the ground. Elevate, accelerate, dominate. My name had been filed off and thrown away. I sat in the back with a paper cup of coffee that tasted like coins. The board nodded on cue. The COO laughed at a slide title that would have embarrassed a sophomore marketing intern. When Victor pronounced the phrase proprietary switching intelligence like he just invented both switching and intelligence, the room actually applauded. It wasn't theft, it was erasure. On my way out, a junior engineer slipped me a folded post-it. "This place doesn't deserve you." I tucked it into the notebook. The following week, facilities rebalanced space. My lab, 12 years of scars, burns, and miracles, was split by a temporary wall. On the other side, Innovation Pod installed a neon sign that read "Make IT Vibrant" in cheerful cursive. They booked the testing chamber for a brand shoot. When I asked to use the vibration table for an actual vibration test, I was told the set would be dark until 4 p.m. for creative flow. A production run hiccuped in Indiana, automation arm jitter at high load. We'd seen the edge case. I had a patch. But the new escalation tree routed the incident to Victor's PM, who promised a rapid cross-functional response, and then set up a meeting for next Tuesday. The line idled for 6 hours. 6 hours at $24,000 an hour. When the plant manager finally called my personal phone, I talked him through a manual workaround from memory while I microwaved last night's noodles. He thanked me like I had sent in the Marines. I logged the call, time-stamped with the cost in the margin. HR scheduled me for narrative coaching. The coach smiled a lot. She had a worksheet about shaping your personal brand. I told her my brand was machines that don't fail. She circled resistance to messaging and recommended a webinar. The fewer tools I had, the more careful I became with the tools I still controlled. Access keys, firmware seeds, certification scripts. None of it malicious, just discipline. When people who don't understand engines start repainting dashboards, you double-check the bolts. I pushed a minor firmware update to a pilot customer with my signature embedded at a layer nobody ever reads. Not a trap, a record. If someone later tried to claim authorship, the cryptographic handshake would disagree. I started meeting Eric, the lawyer who looks like a retired middleweight, once a week, diner booth, hash browns, black coffee. We didn't escalate. We prepared. He asked questions shaped like crowbars. Did the new org chart alter your reporting line in writing? Did they change your scope without amendment? Did anyone remove your name from an internal system of record? We photocopied the budget with the storytelling reallocation. We added it to the notebook. And still I built. I came in early and stayed late. When they cut the purchase order for a new torque sensor, I tore down an old rig and hand-machined a bracket to reuse parts. I swapped espresso for drip. I wore earplugs when the Innovation Pod piped in up-tempo playlists to increase ideation throughput. On a Tuesday, Victor stopped by with a camera crew, internal storytelling. He said, and asked me to hold the soldering iron like a hero. I held it the way you hold a tool that burns at 700 degrees. He frowned. Could we make it more aspirational? I pointed at the warning label. The crew laughed. Victor didn't. The memo about legacy roles arrived the next morning. Sent to a distribution list I wasn't on, forwarded to me by someone who still remembered who built the engine. Words like sunset, reskill, embrace new energy. It read like a poem written by a committee that feared nouns. At the bottom, an org chart. My box had been moved to the side. Thin line to nothing. Title: Special Projects Advisory. No reports, no budget. I printed it. 3 copies, one for the notebook, one for Eric, one for the fireproof box. You can feel when a company decides you're inconvenient. Air gets thinner, smiles sharpen, even the elevators arrive slower. It would have been easy to yell, to send a scorched earth email, to slap faces with receipts. But engines don't shout. Engines hum, steady and lethal. While pressure builds in places management doesn't know to measure, so I calibrated. I took inventory of every promise we'd made to clients that depended on my work. I built a matrix: patent numbers, deployment sites, certification dates, keys. I circled the ones that required my ongoing sign-off under clauses legal had once insisted on to reassure conservative partners. The same clauses Victor had never read. And when the invite landed, quarterly board review, strategic alignment, with Victor listed as the sole presenter on technologies I had authored, I didn't decline. I brought my notebook. I sat in the back. I counted the seconds between each applause break and the next lie. Death by 1,000 cuts is still death. But if you know anatomy, arteries, tendons, load-bearing bones, you also know where to press, where to stitch, and when to let the bleeding speak for itself. I wasn't done. I was measuring. And every cut they made was one more line item in a ledger they would pay with interest. There's always a theater to betrayal. They don't just push you out quietly, they make a show of it. Victor waited until the quarterly board meeting to make his move. Of course he did. He wanted an audience. He wanted applause. The room was staged like a cathedral of arrogance: polished walnut table, bottled water labels turned outward, little triangular nameplates like we were conducting a séance instead of a strategy session. Half the board lounged in ergonomic chairs scrolling their phones, the other half pretended to skim briefing binders. I sat near the back, notebook in my lap, coffee cooling in my hands. Victor stood at the head of the table, suit crisp, grin practiced. He flipped through a manila folder with theatrical precision, pausing just long enough for the room to fall silent. Before we dive into Q3 projections, he said, voice syrupy, there's a small bit of legacy housekeeping we need to address. That's when I saw it, the contract. My original paper agreement, signed 15 years earlier when the company was still a broom closet dream. I recognized the coffee stain on the corner, the crooked angle of my signature written during a Red Bull crash. Seeing it in his hands felt like watching someone pick up a relic from a church altar with greasy fingers. This, Victor announced, holding it up between thumb and forefinger like it was contaminated, is what loyalty is worth. And then he fed it into a shredder, not metaphorically, literally. A beige office shredder groaned to life behind him, chewing inch by inch as Victor looked me dead in the eye. Every few seconds he'd pause, tilt his head like a golden retriever trying to understand sarcasm, then push more paper into the blades. The room filled with the grinding buzz of destruction. You've had a good run, Todd, he said, tone thick with mock sympathy. But let's be honest, R&D needs fresh energy. New blood, people who understand today's pace, not someone coasting on yesterday's ideas. The shredder spat out curled confetti. The board chuckled nervously like they weren't sure if this was a performance or a firing. One director, someone I'd once shared a compliance call sandwich with, looked at me, then immediately looked away, as if eye contact might demote him by association. No HR rep, no formal notice, no packet of transition resources. Just death by shredder, staged for effect. I didn't move, didn't speak. I simply nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a man marking the exact time of death. The humiliation in the air wasn't mine, it was theirs. Because here's what Victor didn't know. That contract he shredded, it was a museum piece, a relic. Years earlier, when the company still relied on handshake deals and borrowed templates, I had seen the loopholes. And with Eric, my lawyer who looked like a retired boxer in a thrift store blazer, I had rewritten the agreement line by line. We buried the most important protection deep inside, a clause so sharp it was practically a blade. In the event of termination deemed in breach of contract, all registered patents credited to the original inventor revert to that inventor in full. It wasn't theory. It was notarized, blockchain timestamped. Filed across 3 servers, 2 continents, and 1 fireproof safe in Eric's basement. Immutable, uneditable. So when Victor shredded that paper in front of the board, grinning like a magician pulling off the world's cheapest trick, he wasn't just humiliating me. He was triggering the very clause that would undo him. I stood slowly, adjusted my jacket like I wasn't seething, and said the only word I spoke that day. Noted. Then I walked out, no shouting, no threats. Just one last glance at the shredder, still humming behind Victor, like it had no idea it had just chewed through the foundation of $1 billion empire. Victor thought I would leave broken. He thought I'd crawl back, begging for severance with my teeth. What he didn't know, what none of them realized, was that engines don't quit when you cut the fuel line. The real engine was already wired to explode, and Victor had just flipped the switch with his own manicured fingers. And I intended to let him believe he'd won, for now. The boardroom door clicked shut behind me, muffling the scrape of leather chairs and the nervous laughter of cowards. To them, it was finished. Victor had shredded a piece of paper, declared me obsolete, and staged my funeral in front of the people who once swore by my work. What they didn't know, what none of them even suspected, was that I had already prepared for this moment years earlier. It started in year 3, back when the company was still too broke to afford in-house counsel and too arrogant to admit it needed one. We just landed our first legitimate contract with a mid-tier robotics firm. Nothing flashy but real. Their lawyers demanded a clean chain of custody for the patents. No gray areas, no vague promises. That's when I realized our original contract, the one Victor had just shredded, was little more than a template pulled off a free business law blog. Generous to the company, careless with me. Loopholes big enough to drive a lawsuit through. I knew then that I couldn't just be an inventor, I had to be a strategist, so I hired Eric. He wasn't the kind of lawyer you find on glossy firm websites. He looked like a retired middleweight fighter who never quite left the ring. Bald, quiet, always chewing mint gum. We met at the same diner every week, booth by the window, hash browns and black coffee. Together, line by line, we rewrote my contract. We didn't just patch the holes, we built armor. Buried on page 12, subparagraph C, we forged my blade, the IP reversion clause. Eric explained it in words I'd never forget. If they fire you clean, they keep the goods, but if they breach, if they skip the process, if they humiliate you instead of following the rules, then everything you've ever built reverts to you. Every patent, every license, every derivative, no debate. It wasn't just ink on paper. We notarized it digitally, one of the first to use blockchain timestamping. Immutable, geo-locked, fingerprint stamped, 3 servers, 2 continents, 1 offline backup in a fireproof safe at Eric's house, a sword waiting in silence. And then for more than a decade, we never spoke of it again. I filed patent after patent, always under the company's banner, but with my name as original inventor. Each one was a brick in their empire, but also another thread tied to that clause. 34 in total, 34 quiet landmines. When the acquisition happened, when Victor strutted in with his shiny shoes and empty buzzwords, legal tried to roll out new NDAs, new digital agreements, endless click-to-accept screens. I never signed, not once. My original contract remained untouched, ironclad, buried like a dormant volcano under their skyscraper of arrogance. So when Victor shredded that relic in front of the board, he didn't close a chapter. He detonated the trigger by publicly terminating me without due process, without HR procedure, without so much as a transition document. He didn't just insult me, he breached the contract. And breach meant everything reverted. Every patent, every process flow, every automation module, all mine again. That night I called Eric. He didn't even sound surprised when I told him what happened. He just chuckled, low and dry, the way a man does when a domino finally tips after years of balancing. "All right," he said, "time to open the vault." The next morning he filed the breach notice. Certified timestamp, notarized contract, blockchain hash. A clause-by-clause compliance audit that showed exactly how Victor's little performance had nuked the foundation of the company's IP portfolio. We didn't send it to Victor. Not yet, we sent it to legal. Their own team first, just to watch the panic bloom quietly in the halls. Because contracts aren't shields. They're swords, and this one was sharpened for 15 years, waiting for the day someone arrogant enough would grab the handle and cut themselves wide open. Victor thought he'd buried me with confetti in a shredder, but I wasn't dead. I was armed. And now the war had officially begun. The breach notice went out on a Monday morning at 9:01 a.m. sharp. Eric timed it that way on purpose. Corporate arrogance is highest right after they finish their overpriced cold brews, he told me. Let's ruin their week before it even starts. The package was clean, surgical. A notarized contract with blockchain verification. A clause-by-clause breakdown highlighting exactly how Victor's little shredder performance wasn't just theater, it was a breach. And then the guillotine, a full list of all 34 patents with registration numbers, licensing status, and current market valuations. It wasn't a letter, it was a weapon. At first, silence. No bluster, no threats, no chest beating. Just the kind of silence that tells you panic has already set in. When the reply finally came, it was wrapped in polite legalese. We dispute the interpretation of this clause. Termination was conducted in accordance with company policy. Not one word about the shredder. Not one word about the fact that the firing had been staged in front of witnesses. They were stalling, hoping I'd blink. But I don't blink. Inside the company, chaos was already leaking through the cracks. A production floor in Indiana ground to a halt when the software module tied to Patent 26 locked up. They tried to bypass my authorization key, but the patch failed and triggered a safety shutdown. 6 hours offline at $24,000 an hour. Do the math, that got their attention. Then came Germany. Our biggest European partner flagged a clause in their licensing contract, ongoing certification from the original patent holder. That was me, not Victor, not the board, me. They sent an email asking for confirmation, not to the company, not to legal, straight to my inbox. I didn't reply, not yet. Meanwhile, Victor strutted through town halls with his trademark grin, talking about seamless operational continuity. But even his voice cracked when someone asked if we still own the tech. His answer was a shaky absolutely. The Q&A ended early. Engineers whispered in Slack threads I wasn't supposed to see. Does this mean we don't own the patents? One message just read, "Is Victor insane?" Eric escalated. He sent a second notice, this time with attachments. The original contract, the blockchain notarization, a compliance audit, and a friendly footnote about potential regulatory review. We even hinted at conversations with federal auditors. It was bluff, but the kind of bluff backed by enough truth to make them sweat through their suits. That's when the sharks started circling. By Wednesday, my voicemail was full. Private equity firms, competitors who had once called us vultures now offering steak dinners. A think tank dangling a consulting contract with more zeros than my first 10 years combined. One CEO sent a gift basket with whiskey older than most of Victor's interns. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Eric loved it. "This is slow dancing with sharks," he said over hash browns at the diner. Every day we delayed, the company bled more leverage. Every hour of downtime, every partner email, every whisper inside their glass walls widened the cracks. By Friday, 3 of their production lines were paused. German clients pulled Q4 orders. Their internal compliance team locked down dev environments like a dam trying to hold back a flood. Word spread fast. Whispers turned into rumors. Rumors turned into doubt. And doubt kills faster than failure. I didn't gloat, didn't post cryptic LinkedIn messages or send told you so texts. I just waited, calm, patient, watching the quiet panic metastasize inside the machine I had once powered. Because Victor thought firing me was the end of the story. But really, it was just the beginning of the reckoning. 47 minutes. That's how long the board hid behind closed doors after I dropped the ultimatum on their table. When I walked into that glass tomb of a boardroom earlier, I wasn't wearing a suit. No silk tie, no cufflinks. Just dark jeans, work boots, and a shirt that still smelled faintly of solder and caffeine. Let Victor play the executive clown in his $2,000 blazer. I came carrying the only thing that mattered. A leather folio with 34 patents, 6 competing offers, and a licensing contract that would decide whether the company lived or bled out. Victor was already there, sleeves rolled up like he'd been firefighting all morning. His eyes looked hollow, jaw tight. For the first time, I believed he hadn't slept. "Todd," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Appreciate you coming in. Let's clear the air, shall we?" I didn't sit. Instead, I opened the folio and slid 2 documents across the polished walnut. The first, a licensing agreement under my terms. $7 million upfront. A 5-year renewable contract with a 25% profit share. Any breach in the deal evaporates. The second, a statement of intent to transfer the entire IP portfolio to a competitor. I let the silence breathe. Two paths, I said calmly. You lease what you don't own, or I sell it to the people you've spent 10 years trying to outrun. The CFO cleared her throat, trying to sound steady. We'll need time to review. You've had time, I cut in. You had time the day Victor shredded my contract. You had time when your lawyers got the reversion notice. You had time every single day you delayed, hoping I'd blink. I don't blink. Victor scoffed, his voice thinner than usual. This is extortion. No, I said, smiling just enough to show teeth. This is rent. You built your empire on my engine, and now you'll pay to keep the lights on. The board exchanged glances. The finance guy with a face like a dried prune leaned forward, whispering something to the legal counsel. No one laughed, no one clapped. The silence wasn't tense anymore, it was terminal. I closed the folio, stood, and walked out. No theatrics, no raised voice, because real power doesn't scream. It waits. 47 minutes later, a young paralegal caught up to me in the lobby. Her hands shook as she passed me a folder. Inside, the licensing agreement signed, every page initialed, ink still wet. A wire slip was clipped to the back. $7 million, same-day transfer. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just exhaled, 15 years of pressure bleeding out of my lungs. They thought they'd fired me. In reality, they had signed a lease on their own survival. That night, I didn't celebrate with champagne. I drove north, away from the skyline, to a house waiting on the lake. Glass front, cedar beams, still unfurnished. I dragged a folding chair onto the deck, poured a drink, and watched the sun bleed into the water. No boardrooms, no shredded contracts, no Victor, just silence, ownership, and freedom. Because revenge wasn't the point. The point was that they would never launch a product, never sign a contract, never face an investor again without the quiet footnote stamped across every page, licensed from the man we tried to erase. I leaned back, glass sweating in my hand, watching the stars scatter across the lake. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel like a cog in their machine. I felt like the whole damn factory, and they'd be paying rent for the rest of their lives.